Brittany, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I am too. We were just chatting a little bit offline, and your specialty is grief. And I thought it was a conversation that needed to be had because, as I had said, that my vision of grief or my idea of what grief was really secluded to one particular thing, which was the loss of a family member or friend that you were really close with. And that brought on grief. But I've come to see and understand that grief is a much there's so much more fits into the bucket of grief and stuff that we don't often talk about or recognize or value. And so I wanted to have a conversation around that. But let's start out by just having you introduce yourself to the audience and then telling us what you do and how you came to do what you do.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Brittany Schoolis. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. A lot of questions I'll get around that. One of the main ones is, do you work with individuals? Yes, I do. That's actually the majority of the work I do is working with individuals. Marriage and family therapy specialty is obviously, yes, we work with families and couples, but we look at things more systemically. So even though I'm working with an individual, I also look at what are other things going on in your world, relationships, environment, all that kind of stuff that could be contributing to what's bringing you in here, even though you're individual on your own.
Mhm,
So
mhm,
that's really all that specialty means. So yes, I do work with
mhm.
individuals. My main specialty is grief, but obviously I work in other areas as well, because of course that grief can come up in many different ways, which we'll
Yeah.
talk about. But I kind of landed in the grief specialty in particular. My paternal grandparents had passed probably about within a month of each other back in 2012. So I obviously had a little bit of my own grief journey, but I really struggled watching my dad grieve and struggled more in the sense of I knew what he was getting wasn't what he needed, or the lack of what he was getting was not okay, but I didn't know what he needed. So all I
Mhm.
knew to do was just sit there and just be with him, which now being in the field that I'm in, I know that's probably one of the best things you can do. Um, and then, starting to do some research before I opened my practice of, what is around for grief work and specialty, and it's actually pretty slim.
Mhm.
So I wanted to start filling that gap a little bit and, not only creating a safe and comfortable, welcoming space for people who are grieving to do their grief work effectively, but to also educate those who are supporting someone who's grieving on how to do that in a healthy fashion. Um, Often things are very well intentioned, but
Mhm.
come off very dismissive and invalidating. So being able to create a space on educating people on how to do that in a way that feels good for someone who's grieving. And then I have had ambiguous losses, which we'll talk about what those are.
Mhm.
My
Mhm.
parents divorced when I was, oh boy, 6 or 7, but it probably didn't finalize till I was 11. But I remember having a thought like a week or so before my parents sat us down, but I remember having a thought of like, this is my family and I really love my family and nobody's going to take this from me. And then our parents sat us down and said,
Mhm.
hey, we're divorcing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a lot of grief and loss in that. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of parallels with that too, having
Yeah.
lost somebody. So we can talk
Yeah.
about some of those too. But that's ultimately what led me to this specialty.
Wow, and actually I'm really glad you brought up the piece of supporting someone who's grieving because that is such a delicate space to be in. People don't know what to say, they don't know what to do, they don't want to do the wrong thing like you mentioned.
Right.
Sometimes I think we pull back and do nothing because we're afraid of
Yes.
doing the wrong thing.
Yep.
And everyone who's grieving is an individual and grieving in their own way. And so there's not like there's not a checklist or a standard protocol
Mm-mm.
for supporting someone who's in grief. It's
Right.
really, it's such an individualized process. So I
Yes.
think we should definitely get into that as well. But
Yes.
let's start talking about ambiguous grief. So can you define that for our listeners, what that means?
Yes. So ambiguous loss, ambiguous grief are um a short explanation is they're living losses. So it's a loss that you experience that doesn't involve death. So this can be the loss of a marriage through divorce. This can be deployment is usually a big one, right? Like they're they're physically gone, but mentally they're still very much present.
Mhm.
Adoption, there can be some ambiguous loss there. Retirement, right? There's ambiguous loss in things that on the surface are seen as very happy and exciting.
Mhm.
There can be sadness with that too. And I think that is a big thing that people overlook. So becoming a new parent as
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
Yes, it's exciting. You brought this new life in the world, you're building your family, and there can be a lot of loss of independence and identity and freedom and all of this stuff. But we
Yeah.
can carry this belief of, well, I don't get to be sad or I shouldn't be sad. So
Mhm.
then we don't allow ourselves to grieve. So it's any of those losses that do not involve a death and sometimes involve adding something positive to your life, but brings I don't want to say elimination always, but the change of
Mhm.
what something looked like that leaves you feeling like, I don't get to be sad about this.
Yes, yes. And I can tell you for sure, I myself, and the podcast is called Mom on the Verge. We have lots of moms listening, so I
Hmm.
think they'll probably identify with this. But
Yeah,
I had a lot of grief when I became a parent. Now, at the time, I did not recognize it. I would never have used that word to describe
for
it.
sure.
But I absolutely, all those things that you said, that like loss of freedom and kind of sense of self and identity, and I just was really grieving those things and feeling like, what's wrong with me? Like, what
Hmm.
is the matter with me? Because I have
Hmm.
this beautiful new healthy baby and everyone around me is so excited. And not
Yeah.
that I wasn't excited, but I was also feeling all these, I didn't expect the feelings. Let's put it that way. That which is
Right.
hard, when you don't expect the feelings and they kind of, I felt like a wave, like a huge wave was washing over me. It is hard to like figure it out. Like it's very confusing, I guess is the
Yes.
way I felt. I
Yes.
felt very confused as to why I was having these feelings and what they all meant when I
Mm.
thought this was supposed to be this beautiful, magical, happy time.
Mhm.
And instead I was feeling a lot of these really negative emotions.
Yeah. And so the grief that can come from these ambiguous losses, and quick thing, ambiguous losses, there's two types. So you have psychologically present, but physically absent.
Mhm.
So that's going to be like deployment or adoption or all that kind of stuff, right? We very
Okay.
much think about them and feel them, but physically they're nowhere to be found or we don't know where
Right.
they are. And then you have the physically present, but psychologically absent. So this is going to be Alzheimer's, right?
Okay.
Physically they're with us, but everything about them that made them who they are, that, had us connecting to them, that has pretty much gone.
Okay.
So even people who are in anticipatory grief stages or experiences of, we know they're going to pass here, they can already experience some of that ambiguous loss. So grief can already happen in
Yeah.
those pieces. So keeping that in mind too, of, ambiguous loss can apply to some death losses as well, but more often than not, it's attached to situations where there isn't a death, which
Okay.
then the grief we experience, what you're talking about, Katie, is something that falls into disenfranchised grief, where it gets overlooked because it's not something we think needs to be grieved.
Mhm.
And
Mhm. Mhm.
motherhood and
Yeah.
all of that can fit into that of, well, I shouldn't grieve. There's no reason for me to grieve. I'm exactly what you
Yeah.
said. If I have a healthy baby, it's exciting. Everybody's excited for me,
Yeah.
right? I should have nothing to be sad about and be grieving.
Yes.
And because people don't ask, how are you doing? Or they
Right.
do, but they're expecting,
A certain
tell me how
response.
excited you are, right?
Yes.
Or they kind of answer for you of like, isn't
Right.
this so exciting? You're kind of like,
Yeah.
yes, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
also really sad, right? For
Right.
figuring out what does this now mean for me as an individual?
Right. Absolutely. And people will say things like, oh, I bet you're tired, or kind of like the physical stuff that comes along with it. Oh, how's the
Hmm.
breastfeeding going? If you're breastfeeding, like things like that. But yes, there's not a like, how are you feeling? And it's okay to
Right.
say, not great, actually.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
feeling all these things I didn't expect to be feeling, and they're very unpleasant.
Yeah.
And I don't know when I'm ever going to feel better from this. Um,
Hmm.
and I also have experienced a grief, and this kind of falls into that, like, probably physically present. What did you call it? Physically present, but
Psychologically absent.
psychologically absent. I don't know if it would fall into that either. But so I have two children. One of my children has really struggled with mental and physical health problems. And so it
Hmm.
has dramatically changed our family. And it changed it from what it was from prior to her, having these symptoms. And it certainly changed my expectation of what our family would be and what
Oh, for
family
sure.
life would be. And there's
Hmm.
been a huge grief associated with that.
Absolutely. And I would say that could, I mean, you could push back if you disagree if this doesn't fit into your understanding of it, but I would say that would definitely fit into physically present but psychologically absent in the sense of the psychological side of her or how she functioned mentally before the symptoms is no longer there or it's different.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so there can be grief of what used to be, what could have been, and then just grief around watching the struggle around whatever those mental
Yeah.
health battles are.
Hmm.
Right. So, yeah, chronic illness,
Hmm.
parents who are struggling with, autism,
Hmm.
Down syndrome, whatever it might be, of
Yes.
this expectation. Right. And that's
Right.
another disenfranchised grief of how can you grieve something that wasn't even there? It's like, well, but it's
Right.
the expectation or the dream or the hope of what it could have been. That's very
Yes,
real.
it
And we
is.
have to grieve that.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I'm a loss, here I come back to another one. When I start thinking about it, I'm like, I've actually experienced a lot of grief in my
Yeah.
life that I did not label as grief, and I'm sure I am not alone in saying that. But I developed chronic migraine after the birth of my
Hmm.
second child. And I went through a really dark period with that, and I am thankfully through that very dark period, but it is still a very big part of my life, and it impacts my life
Hmm.
substantially for the past 10 years. And there's a grief with that as well, because
Yeah.
when you have a chronic illness, you're not the same person you were before you had the chronic illness.
Right.
And
Yes.
you can't do all the same things that you could do before. And you feel like there's this piece of you that's really you, but like
Mhm.
can't be expressed because of the illness.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
there's that type of grief as well.
Yeah, and there can be aspects of you, right? And that's a big thing that will, and I mean, you can tell me what you hear from your listeners or what other guests have discussed in regards to becoming a parent and a mom and all of that. But identity is a big thing,
Mhm.
right? Of, you know, I don't have children, full disclosure, but we are actively trying for children. And there's even, I can't speak for anybody else, but for myself, there's even an identity loss in that of, and the unknown of how is my identity going to change? I know it's going to, and I'm already struggling with, I don't really want it to,
Right, right.
right? And then figuring out the pieces about my identity that are current, I
Mhm.
really want to be present when I'm also a parent. So how is that crossover going to look?
Yeah.
Right? So there can be some grief for the listeners who are actively trying, who aren't parents yet, or whatever that might be. There can be grief in anticipating how your life is going to change,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And
Absolutely.
and then too, I don't know how much you talk about this, but I do want to just make space for and validate and normalize that there is grief around miscarriages, stillbirths,
Oh, yes.
infertility, all of that. And
Uh,
that's a big disenfranchised grief category that people are like, you you never had a child. Why are you grieving that? Oh my
yeah.
gosh. So please, please,
Yes.
please give yourself grace and space to grieve that because that is very real.
It is very real. Actually, I don't know if you know, I'm a labor and delivery nurse.
Okay.
So I work with those patients, and their grief
Hmm.
is just palpable. I mean,
Yeah.
it is so heartbreaking.
Hmm.
And it's something that people still to this day, I feel like don't talk about as much as it would it would benefit them to talk about it. Like it needs to be a
Yes.
broader conversation in our society in
Yes.
a way that it's still not. And I think you're right that
Hmm.
that group still feels very much alone in their
Yep.
grief.
Hmm.
Because we're just not having the conversation
Right.
about even patients who they are grieving because they come to the end of the line with their fertility treatments, and they realize that creating a family in the way that they wanted to create a family or thought they would create a family is not going to happen for them. They
Right.
could potentially create a family in a different way, but
Mhm.
they had a vision in mind of how they were going to do this
Right.
and what it was going to look like. And there's a big grieving process that
Hmm.
goes along with letting go of that vision and that dream.
Right. Yeah. And I always say, I say it's okay, even though it doesn't feel okay, but it's okay in that that's natural. Right. And it's,
Mhm.
allow yourself to have the space to go, yeah, I get to be sad about this. I think
Yeah.
oftentimes people, I've heard it communicated as, well, that's me trying to control something that's out of my control. Well, yeah, you're human.
Mhm.
right? That makes sense. Or, that's me, if there's a religious component of that's me fighting God's plan. Okay, fair. And how can we
Right,
feel like we're not fighting God's plan, but also allowing ourselves to grieve?
right.
Um, so there can be a lot of complexities
A
that
lot of
come.
complexities. And
Mhm.
that brings up a great point, which is, um, we live in a society now that is really spending a lot of time focusing on gratitude, which I will, full disclosure, I'm a huge proponent of gratitude.
Yeah.
I think it really works in, so many aspects of life. But
Mhm.
sometimes we can't gratitude our way out of things, right? Sometimes and like you're saying, the person says, well, this is God's plan, I shouldn't be sad. Or someone says, like, I should be grateful because I have the following things, I shouldn't be sad. But I feel like that's almost gaslighting yourself, or just
Yeah.
ignoring this whole portion of your
Mhm.
being that is really, um, it's asking to be expressed, and
Right.
we're trying to put a blanket over it and pretend like it's not there.
Right. Yeah. It's this whole idea of toxic positivity,
Hmm.
right? Oh, I'm just, I'm grateful for this. And yeah, this is really awful, but I at least I have which that can be true. And also the fact that it's awful can be true. So a couple of different things of a lot of, in situations like this, I'll talk to clients about this idea of both
Hmm. Hmm.
and this coexistence of I can acknowledge this is really awful. This sucks. This is not what I wanted. And I can be
Hmm.
grateful for whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Right. So if we go back to your example of when you were experiencing, this is supposed to be a super exciting time and I have a healthy baby and all this stuff and everyone around me is super exciting, but I'm like sad and I'm struggling and
Yeah.
I'm having really heavy emotions, all this stuff. Both experiences can be true,
Yeah.
right? You can sit there and look like, wow, this is great. I have a healthy baby. We're growing our family. People are excited for me. They're supporting me. And
Hmm.
I can be struggling.
Right.
So I think that is where we can incorporate gratitude absolutely, while also leave room for the reality of, yeah, this is what's happening. So what am I going to do with it?
Yeah. And that is the question. What do people do about it? I, was never walked through any of this with a therapist, because I didn't even know I was grieving.
Yeah.
I
And
thought,
most don't. Yeah,
yes,
most don't.
I thought there was just something wrong with me, and who knows all the thoughts that ran through my head, but I really handled it on my own. In retrospect, that was not the best plan. And I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, and I won't do it in the future. But I remember vacillating, and having times where I kind of sunk into the grief. And it was like I was just feeling the grief. I wasn't even trying to talk myself out of the grief. Like I was
Yep.
just in it. But then I would do that for a while, and then I would recognize, ooh, this is getting a little dangerous. Like this is kind of dangerous territory. I
Yep.
can't just sit here, or this could go. I've had periods of depression in my life, so I know
Hmm.
what that looks like and feels like. And I remember thinking like, oh, I'm on like a precipice here, and I need to start walking in the other direction. And
Yep.
so there was this like push pull where I'd have moments where I was like trying to be more grateful and looking towards the things that I was really grateful for, and really being present, and
Hmm.
doing all of my practices that I knew were good for me. But then I'd have days where I was like, nope, just sitting in the grief today. But then
Yep.
I'd have to pull myself back out again. So that was my process. But
Yes.
what do you recommend to your patients? Like, how do you walk them through this journey?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. And I will say this, and I actually have a podcast episode on this of it's this sitting in the grief or sitting with grief
Mhm.
that can be beneficial to a degree, right? It can be beneficial in the sense of I'm just going to acknowledge this, right? I'm going to stop resisting. I'm going to say, yep,
Mhm.
this is real. I'm going to allow myself to feel it, right? And feeling it and expressing it looks different for everybody.
Mhm.
And there are times where it's like, okay, now you're starting to get flooded. Now you're
Mhm.
starting to get consumed by the grief. How do we start pulling you out of that? So it's gauging for yourself what that feels like. And, the guidance with a professional can definitely help with that. Um, in guiding people in these processes, the first thing specifically with ambiguous losses or living losses, um, recognizing it, labeling it as this is a loss. And
Mhm.
specifically, what have I lost?
Yeah.
Right. So, well, I'm a new parent. Okay. But expand on that for me. What does that mean? Right. So for
Mhm.
me, I've already done a lot of potential loss work. Will it come to fruition? maybe, maybe not. I don't
Mhm.
know. But I'm, and obviously in the field that I work in, right? I
Mhm.
probably
Good.
do too much work. But I've done a lot of work
Right.
around, okay, here are the parts of my identity that I really do not want to lose, that I'm fearful could
Mhm.
possibly lose based on what society tells me parenthood has to look like.
Yeah.
Um, so I've already labeled, okay, I have a theater degree. So I'm like, I have a fear of that I can't do theater anymore. Right. So that piece of identity is going to have lost.
Mhm.
Um, I have a fear of how our marriage is going to shift. It will shift. I know
Mhm.
that. I can't prevent that.
Mhm.
Right. But how can I encourage it to shift in a way that's still going to benefit the both of us?
Mhm.
Right? So listing what are the losses that you've experienced, whether it's
Yeah.
identity, freedom, job, right? What does that look like for you? So recognizing first, yes, this is a loss, and what specifically have I lost?
Yeah, that's great. And I think, well, I'll have to tell you two things related to that. First of all, putting the name to it that it is grief is huge.
Mhm.
When I had already been through a bunch of these, grieving processes and I thought I was past them, but when I realized that they were grief and I actually could name it as grief, it
Yep.
was so healing.
Yeah.
It was it's just a word. I don't know why. I don't know why it was
But
so
think about what it
profound.
allows you to do that you weren't doing before.
It was like permission almost that like
Yeah.
all those feelings that I had were very valid and real and okay to have, which
Mhm.
I don't know why that makes such an impact, but for me it did. I was like, oh my gosh, that was grief. I was grieving.
Yeah, you're
And
not
I
alone in that. That's a
ah,
huge. I have another podcast episode on what it means by giving someone permission to grieve, because you don't, it's your stuff, right? Like
right. Like, why do I
you
need
grieve all
permission?
day
Yeah,
long, right?
yeah,
But people
yeah,
feel like they need that, especially in these ambiguous losses or this disenfranchised grief. They feel like they need someone to say, you get to grieve this. This is
yeah,
okay. So I'm
yeah,
even curious for the listeners right now of as you're listening to this and going, oh my God, that's me. Oh, oh my gosh, I'm grieving, right? Like, do you feel a sense of comfort or
yes.
release or whatever it might be? Because yeah, just labeling it is huge.
Huge, huge. I cannot tell you. And I actually happened to be listening. That's probably how I got the idea for our podcast episode because I was listening to a podcast where they were talking about grief. And I was like, oh my God, I've been grieving all these things. I had no idea. That makes a lot
Yeah.
of sense now.
Mhm.
The second part I want to just say to you is that like you are so far ahead in the parenthood game by having done all of this work. I wish so much that someone would have sat me down and been like, okay, when you become a parent, think about the following things and how they're going to
Yep.
change and that you're going to have feelings around them and they're not always going to be good. And, I mean, I was so uninformed.
For sure. And normalizing that for you too, right? Of look at the field that I'm in, right? I mean,
Mhm.
this is what I do day in and day out as I sit with clients and process these things and right. So
Yeah.
I look at things a little bit differently. So
Yeah.
normalizing, if
Mhm.
you did not do that or you have not done that, that is okay.
Yeah.
Right. I've talked to couples too of like, how much conversation did you guys have before having children around what parenting would look like and how this would
Yeah.
affect your marriage? Like, and they sit there almost shamefully of like, um,
None.
none. And I said, that's okay.
Yeah.
Right? Like that, it is okay. Right? So give
Yeah.
yourself some grace of if you didn't do that work, okay,
Yeah.
let's look at
But
it.
at the same time, absolutely, I totally agree. But at the same time, it would be great if anyone's listening to this episode,
Yeah.
now they know, right?
Mhm.
Or if you're listening to this episode and you have a child who's maybe coming near that, stage in
Yeah.
their life, like that these are the conversations that they can have
Yeah.
beforehand and then after, so
Yeah.
that, because until it happens, it's all theoretical. Until you
Oh,
experience it, you just really never know how it's going to go down and what it's going to look like and feel like.
mhm.
But at least you know that if you're experiencing these feelings, there's a reason and it's real and it's
Yes.
valid and like what you can do about it
Yes.
and talking to your partner about it. I mean, I think that I always joke because my husband and I, we were married Catholic, but before we got married, we read all these marriage books and we went to this like weekend long retreat on marriage and did all this, work. And then we got married, of course, and whatever. But then when you have a kid, it's like no one does anything. No one No one tells you anything. No one educates you. No one,
Yeah.
nothing. There's like no preparation really, other
Yeah.
than you can go to a baby class where they talk about birthing or breastfeeding or, diapers and sleeping habits, but there's no preparation for like how you will
Yes.
change and your relationship with your partner will change after this
Right.
child comes along.
Right.
And we could really be saving marriages. We could be saving
Mhm.
a lot of trauma, a lot of hurt, a lot of mental health disorders if we started having these conversations sooner.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I'd be curious if some of the reason as to why we don't talk about it is because, well, what do we don't know, right? We don't know until we get in there. It's like, well, yes. And,
Yeah. Yes.
um, the, there are patterns, themes, right? I mean, a lot of the things I sit with clients about is identity is a big one. I don't know
Hmm.
who I am now that I'm a mom, like all I am as a mom or a
Hmm.
dad or a parent, however you identify. Um, and then I don't know how to relate to my spouse anymore.
Yeah.
Right. Or I'm feeling resentful or I'm feeling angry because they're not doing A, B, or C. Right. So I think if those are if you have any conversation, I think the biggest conversations you can have are about for yourself, identity, explore that of how might identity change. It
Yeah.
may not change that way, but what are some fears on how it could look? And if
Hmm.
you don't know, okay, that's fine, right?
Yeah.
So then it's look at what pieces of your identity are important to you now that you want to try and hold on to.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
how might you do that?
Yeah.
Again, you won't know until you're in it, but being able to label those and keep those in mind when you have
Hmm.
the child, that will allow you to be a little bit more proactive than getting
Yeah.
into it and going, um, who am I now? Right. And if you have moments like
Oh.
that too, that's okay. That is okay.
Yes. And even if you don't do it beforehand and you're listening to it now and you're even 5, 10 years into this journey of parenthood,
Yeah.
however far you are into this journey of parenthood, you can still ask those
Yes.
yourself questions.
Absolutely. There's no expiration date on these conversations,
Yes.
right?
Yes. And the answers will change over time.
Yeah, yes, they
Yeah.
will. So
Yeah.
identity and then expectations.
Hmm.
Expectations for yourself. And that one you would have probably more, well, both of these you can have with your partner, right? Identity explore for yourself and then go to your partner and say, here are some aspects that are really important for me. How do we keep this in our lives, right?
Yeah.
So, theater is a big thing for me. So I've talked a lot to my husband about what are we going to do with a newborn and I want to do a show.
Right.
He's like, well, we'll figure it out, right? Like think rehearsals are usually in the evening and, then the bedtime, all this kind of stuff. And then expectations are, that's a big one to have with your spouse or partner.
Yeah.
Um, Expectations of each other, expectations of just what this is going to look like. Right. And then kind of doing hypotheticals, being careful not to drive yourself mad with
Mhm.
hypotheticals, but like, okay, hypothetically, we run into an instance where our parenting styles don't align.
Mhm.
What do we do? Right. Or,
Yeah.
I'm feeling really stressed out and I need a minute. How do I come to you and ask for that?
Yeah.
Right. What are your biggest concerns? What are your fears? What are you most excited about? You can have exciting conversations too. It doesn't have to
Right.
be all struggle, right? Like
Yeah.
have those exciting, like, what are you looking forward about being a parent? Right. What are
Yeah.
you, all of that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
identity and expectations, I would say, are the two biggest conversations.
Conversations. Yeah.
And then, like
And
you said, they will change, right? So they're on a spectrum, they're flexible. So
mhm.
as your life circumstances change, as you
Mhm.
change, as your children get older, reevaluate, sit down again and go, okay, how are
Yeah.
you feeling?
Yeah. And I would say that's also another kind of grief. What I was going to ask you is because, yes, we all change as we get
Mhm.
older and different life experiences. And so I think there's also a grieving of when we recognize that we are no longer the person that we were. There's a grieving of that. And do you notice that some people are actually trying to hold on to this person that they were before, even though it doesn't really serve them in their current life, but they're in resistance to
Yep.
accepting that they have changed?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it can be for a couple of different reasons, but I think one of the biggest ones is it's familiar.
Hmm.
Right? We will
Yeah.
stay or hold on. We will stay in uncomfortable situations or unhelpful situations or hold on to things that we know aren't serving us because they're familiar. We know what to expect. We know how to handle it. We know how it feels versus if I go out and explore this unknown but potentially really good thing, I
Mhm.
don't know what I don't know how to prepare myself for that. I don't know what to do with that. So we can resist it. And so then in that sense, if people are sitting with me where they have, they can communicate like, yeah, I think I've changed, but I want this part of me or whatever it is,
Mhm.
the I'll ask. So if it's seen as a bad symptom, and I put that in air quotes, right? Or something that is negative or hard, I'll ask them, okay, then how is it serving you?
Mhm.
Right? Because if we are holding on to something that's even perceived as negative or unhelpful, it is serving us in some way.
Right.
Right. So that's kind of reframing of, okay, how is it serving me? Well, I know that person and I really
Right.
loved that person.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know this person now, and I don't even know if I love this person, and that feels
Yes.
icky. I
Yeah.
don't want to sit in that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we can
Yeah.
work with that,
Right.
right?
Right.
And know
Yeah.
too that, and you can push back if you disagree, and I'd be curious to hear your experiences, but there can be aspects of your old self that can weave into the new version of you. They just might
Yeah.
look different, right? If you want to
Yeah.
completely shift and, change altogether, great. But if there are
Yeah.
aspects of you that you want to still carry with you,
Right.
figure out how
Yeah.
to weave that into your new identity.
It's so true. And I coach women on finding their purpose in like
Mm,
kind of midlife. I call them middle moms, but it's like those moms their kids are really gaining independence or like middle school
yeah.
age. They're really like much more focused on their friends and they're out and they're playing sports. And all of a sudden, the moms are like, oh, I don't have this like 24/7 responsibility of these kids. They're becoming independent. And I'm not sure what this next phase of my life looks like and
Yeah.
what I want and what's important to me and what lights me up and inspires me and excites me and what am I passionate about and they're just kind of in this weird in between phase and I
Mhm.
went through that and I totally understand it and I was like women need help with this because we
Yeah.
end up kind of filling our time with a bunch of stuff that doesn't actually need to get done because we don't really know
Yeah.
what we want, right?
Yeah.
Women will say, I don't have time, I don't have time. But when they really start looking at their days, they recognize how much stuff they're doing that is not serving them. It's not serving their children, their partner, their job. It's not
Right.
serving really anything other than as a barrier or
Mhm.
like a um, it's preventing them from looking inward, going
Right.
inward and looking at what they really want.
Yeah.
Because, like you said, it's the unknown and it's
Right.
very uncomfortable. And what is it going to look like?
Yeah.
And it is really a giving up of the old self, which for women, I can only speak for myself, but I do think this is probably a broadly like I don't ever think that my experience, I'm like the only one experiencing it. We live in the society where youth is really valued in women.
Yeah.
And as we start to age, there's that loss as well that you
Mhm.
start to recognize, like, I am no longer young. I don't fit into that category of what our society values as youth and beauty. And I mentioned that I'm a nurse and I work with a lot of like younger nurses. And as
Mhm.
I started getting older, I was recognizing like, oh, I am not them anymore. Like I'm in a
Mhm.
different space in my life than what they're in and that was really uncomfortable for me.
Sure.
There was a grief with that
Yeah.
I was going to be looked at by society differently because in our
Mhm.
society we just don't look at middle-aged women the same way that we
Mhm.
look at young women.
Right.
And so there's so many little ways, there's so many things that make us grieve throughout our life that they're
Yeah.
so they can be almost imperceptible if you're not paying attention, but they
Right.
are affecting you, like they
Oh,
are.
yeah.
And I've always been like mentioning what you said, like weaving things back in. Like I've always loved being in nature and hiking and traveling. And these are always big parts of my identity. And yes, they are still things that I love and things that I incorporate into my life. But I have to do them differently because I
Right.
can't do them like when I was in my
Yes.
20s and my husband and I would sling like 60-pound packs on our backs and walk for 2 weeks in the woods without seeing a
Yeah.
human. Like that's like not realistic for my
Yeah.
life.
Right.
I don't think it's realistic for my body. But do I still want to be out there? Yes. And I want to find
Yeah.
a way that I could do it in this phase of my life that serves me, that I can still enjoy what I
Yes.
love, but I'm doing it in a way that it's not hurting my body and I'm trying to be something that I'm not
Yep.
anymore. Yeah.
One of my biggest barriers to exploring becoming a parent and growing a family, all this stuff, was this idea of a very common phrase that at least I've heard of, like, oh, well, you just can't do that anymore when you become a parent. And I'm like, okay. Right. Or there will
That
be
is
these things.
terrible.
There will be I was listening, this was a while ago, but I was listening to the radio station, and the DJ, his daughter had newborns, younger kids. And she was saying, she's like, Dad, I just don't get it. I'm like, I should be happy. Like, I have a great job. I have a great husband. I have two healthy, beautiful kids. She's like, but I'm just like sad. Right. I'm just sad because we don't go out anymore. Like, this is all my life is, right? I go to work, and I think she was like working from home too. Right. So like she
Yeah.
never left the house. And if she did, it was to drop her kids off to daycare, all this kind of stuff. And the callers would say, like, that's just what parenthood is. And inside I am raging. I'm like,
Raging. Do
right. I'm
not
like,
tell this woman this.
right. I'm like, if that is parenthood, I am, take me off that sign up list.
Yes.
Absolutely not. So I'm normalizing that if you hear that,
Yes.
okay,
Yeah.
right. And if you panic, I'm right there with you. And knowing you get to reclaim your independence, right? That does not have to be the mold that you fit into if you don't want to.
Yes. Yes.
Does that mean you give it the big middle finger and say, I'm still going to do whatever I want to do? No. But we adapt, right?
Yeah.
If someone comes up to me and says, well, you just can't do theater anymore,
Right.
because who's with the baby when you're at home? Well, that would be my husband.
Right. Right.
Right. And also, yes, I can.
Yes.
Last year I did 3 shows. Will I do 3 shows in a year? Probably not, at least not right away.
Right.
But do I still get to do theater? Yes, but it will just adapt in what it looks like, how often I do it, the time commitment, right?
Yeah.
So keeping in mind, I really encourage, and this, everybody's experience is going to be different, but I really encourage, try not to be so black and white or so rigid with what you can do.
Yeah.
There may be some things where you're like, my body, I just can't do that anymore. Okay. Right. But there may be some things where you can flex a little and
Yeah.
say, yeah, I would still like to do this. Let's explore how. It won't look the same without kids, but how
Right.
can I do it that
Yeah.
still brings me joy?
Yes. And I think when we really start looking at our life, most people have a pretty small list of non-negotiables, right? Most people, when they really start looking, there's really only a few things that they're like, this is so important to me. I like do not want to give this up. The rest of it, a lot of things just fall by the wayside. You like it, you enjoy it, it adds value to your life. It's, it's not like you don't want to do it, but if you can't, for whatever reason, you're in a phase of parenting that's more challenging and more hands-on and whatever, you're like, okay, like that's kind of probably not going to happen that much until they get a little older, but it's fine. But then you have your non-negotiables, right? Your pieces that are like, this has to be part of my life.
Yes.
And I think there's a journey to even figuring out what that is.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then setting boundaries and asking for help. And, I can't tell you how many, so as a nurse, I've worked every 3rd weekend since my kids were born, and I will leave at Saturday morning at 5:30 in the morning, get home at 8:30 at night, crash, do the same thing the next day. And so my husband had the kids every 3rd weekend, our entire, journey of parenthood.
Yeah.
And that's the nurse's life, and all nurses who have kids, like it's, spouses know, like you're going to have the kids for long periods of time by yourself. But I ran into so many parents who are not nurses, mothers who were like, oh no, I can't. He needs help. I can't leave him alone with the baby or the kids or the whatever. And that's a story we're telling ourselves.
Right.
Because this person actually is a fully formed adult and can do it.
Right. And it's a partnership.
Yes.
Right. Like, and this is where having those conversations around expectations of, I think in passing, we can know like, oh yeah, we're a partnership, but then in practice, it doesn't always look that way. And will it always look that way? No. Right. So when I talk to couples, and whether they're married or just dating or whatever, long-term partners, whatever, I'll ask them, do you want a balanced marriage or relationship, or do you want an equal
Mm,
marriage or relationship? Usually they say equal. I'm like, okay, then tell me what that means. Right. And what we actually strive for is balance, because
mhm,
it's this idea of we want to be on the same playing field for the most part. But there are going to be instances where one has to work for a full weekend. So then one side might go up a little bit higher and the other one might come down. Okay, then we even out. And then
mhm,
there's going to be instances where we're sick or financially we can't contribute the way that we
yeah,
used to. So we want it to kind of be in those little scales where they go up and down, but we are
mhm,
able to level out and stay on a playing field for the most part. So
yeah,
that we want to have a balanced partnership. And what does that look like when it comes to parenting?
yeah. Oh my God, I love that so much. That is such a great nugget. I had the hair standing up on my arms because I think that that is really like it's again nuance, like it's just two different words, balance versus equal, but
Right.
it really does carry such different meaning.
Mhm.
And my husband and I joke all the time. I'm like, we're like some throwback marriage where like things are pretty traditional in our house. Like he
Sure.
does the lawn work and I clean and whatever. But we have certain strengths. Each of us has certain
Mhm.
strengths, and we're very different. So those strengths are very different. And
Yeah.
so we try to play to each other's strengths in both marriage and in parenthood,
Yeah.
where we are not equal. We do not do the same equal things. But I do feel that we are balanced in that
Yes.
what he does and takes care of and is good at, I am like, take it, brother.
Yeah.
I don't
More
want
power
any
to
part of
you.
that. More power to you.
Run. Yeah. Run
Yes.
with it. Yeah.
Run with it. And then I have my strengths in what I do. And yes,
Yeah.
there are moments where I'm like, I feel like I'm doing more than him, or, I need
Yeah.
you to pick up more of this, that, or the other. Like it's an ongoing conversation and an
Right.
ongoing like process. But I love that idea of balance, that we don't all have to be doing exactly the same amount of the
Yes.
same things, that we each come to this
Yeah.
partnership with different strengths and
Right.
things that we can contribute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Having an equal relationship is just completely unrealistic, right? Because
Yeah.
we're human. There are going to be times where we can't give 50-50,
Yeah.
and that's okay.
Yeah.
Right? As long as we communicate about it and we understand what that means, and then it's a give and take, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, this idea of, oh, well, I can't leave him by himself. Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
Talk about it, right? Talk about
Right.
it. We want to make
Right.
sure we don't have this unspoken expectation, but
Yeah.
you can,
Yeah. And
right?
accept that things are probably not going to be done the way that you would do them,
Right.
but that's
And
okay.
and also accept that there may be some grief in that too.
Yeah.
Right?
Mhm.
Especially for the moms, I would imagine they're on maternity leave for however long and then they go back to
Oh,
work.
yeah.
There's grief in that. I cannot tell
Hmm.
you how many people I've sat with in my personal life and in the therapy world of, ask them, how are you feeling about going back to work? And they're really sad about it.
Yeah.
Right? Even though that they're going back to work to a career that they absolutely love.
Yep.
Right? And this is one of the parallels in grief, whether it's common loss, so the death of a loved one, or this ambiguous loss, these living losses.
Hmm.
A parallel is what used to matter before may not matter now.
Yeah.
I've sat with many, many people where they're like, I working hours on end, just I
Yeah.
doesn't matter to me anymore.
Right.
Okay. But you still want to, but I still want to work. I still want that to be part of my identity. Okay, let's adapt.
Yeah.
Right? What
Yeah.
aspects of that can we weave in where maybe you spend more now time being a parent,
Yeah.
and your working life isn't as strong as it used to be, or isn't as apparent, right? And as
Hmm.
it used to be.
Yeah. There's a lot of questioning in parenthood in general from probably conception. I wouldn't even say birth.
Mhm.
From conception forward,
Oh, sure.
at least for moms, there's a lot of questioning because yes, so much. I actually just recorded an episode on matrescence. It hasn't even been released yet, but it may be by the time listeners are hearing this episode. And if not, be on the lookout for the episode on matrescence. But it talks about like all of these changes that occur
Mhm.
both inside and outside of us when we enter motherhood, but it doesn't ever stop. It's just this continuous changing of
Yeah.
our mind, body, spirit, and soul that is really like prompted by motherhood and all the changes that our kids go through, because our kids go through
Mhm.
these changes and then that creates changes in us. And
Yes.
so it is an ongoing process of grieving what was and leaning into what is, and grieving what
Yeah.
was and leaning into what is. and figuring out how you want this next phase to look like.
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
I say with that, find your anchors,
Hmm.
right? Like you're saying there's non-negotiables. There are anchors too of like, regardless of what changes, this is this is what ties me to my core,
Yeah.
right? Whether it's an activity or a person or a personality trait or a belief or whatever, right? Find your anchors because as the wind blows and that ship
Hmm.
rocks, yeah, you're going to turn, you're going to shift, you're going to go back and forth, but at least you're
Yeah.
not moving all over the lake, right?
Right.
You're
Right.
staying in one spot for the most part, right? And when
Yeah.
the wind blows, you might have to redefine your role, right? As you were talking about
Hmm.
mothers who kind of get into that empty nester phase of
Hmm.
life or the older phase of like, oh, okay, now I have so much me time. I
Right.
don't know what to do with this, right? A lot of it is redefine your role as a mom,
Yeah.
right? Women can get stuck in that of like, I don't know what being a mom looks like anymore because
Yeah.
the only way I know how to do it, my kids don't need,
Right.
right? Which
Right.
can leave them feeling like they don't have purpose, right? Purpose is a big
Yes.
thing that people grieve as well,
Yes.
right?
Huge.
So find your anchors
Hmm.
and figure out, so that way when the tides change,
Yes.
right, you have something at least grounding you.
Yeah. It's funny that you use that analogy because I used to say to my husband, like, I feel like I'm this little boat in this was the visual in my head, this little boat in this huge ocean in the
Yeah.
middle of a raging storm. And life is just like throwing me wherever it feels like throwing me. And I have zero control, you know?
Yep.
And that wasn't the reality. I mean, it's the reality of how I felt, but you don't have to feel that way. But
Right.
have your anchors and you have your non-negotiables and you go and you do that internal work and you really,
Mm-hmm.
get to know yourself. But I wasn't doing that at that time. And
Yeah.
I just I felt like I was just at the mercy of whatever life
Yeah.
threw at me. And that's a terrible feeling.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
terrible feeling. I never want another woman to feel that way. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I will even say, there may be pockets of moments where you do have your anchors and you still feel like the ocean is just rocking your world and you're like,
yeah.
what is happening? Right. So again, giving yourself grace of,
Yeah.
I tell people like, yeah, okay, I'm a therapist, but come on now. I'm
Right.
also human. I
Right.
have my own struggles and I also
Yeah.
go to therapy. I tell clients if
Yeah.
you see a therapist who have never gone to therapy themselves, run,
Right. Right. Yes.
right?
Yes,
Run.
right. Right. And
Yeah.
I'm a coach and I have a coach.
Yeah.
So, I mean, because it's hard to see your own stuff. It's hard to
Right.
get out of your own way. And there are, people with just different perspectives or they're further in the journey or
Mhm.
whatever, their different life experiences. We can all learn from each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, let me check our time. We did talk about the fact that we were going to discuss what did you call it? The grief that I like knew of grief to be, where you lose a person that you're close to. Did you call
Hmm.
that a particular type of grief?
I mean, that would fall into like that ambiguous loss.
Okay. Do you
Yeah.
want, because we talked about like, we don't know how to be with someone or what to do for someone who's
Oh, the
experiencing
support. Yeah. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
support. I don't know if we have enough
Mhm.
time. Do we have some time to talk about that or is it too
Yeah.
big of a
I mean,
topic to cover?
yeah, I mean, that could be a whole episode in and of itself. But
I
I
feel
mean,
like it could.
supporting loved ones who are grieving, whether that's around a death loss or a non-death loss.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can definitely talk about it. Are there certain questions or things that come to mind in regards
I
to that?
guess so. I guess my biggest question is how do we know what to say and do versus not what to say and do? And
Yes.
what's the like most helpful thing we can do for someone? I know these are really big questions that are hard to answer, but
Yeah.
I know there are also questions that people are thinking and asking
Yeah.
themselves. Yeah.
I would say anything, and this is going to sound really vague, but I'll break it down. I would say anything that falls into the bucket of labeling their experience for them, or the very blanket statement, well-intentioned comments. So for people who have passed, it's they're in a better place or they're no longer hurting, those kind of things, which sure, that can be true. And that
Mhm.
feels very dismissive because we
Yeah.
don't know where the person who's grieving, we don't know where they are.
Yeah.
Um, and that might be something they actually are really struggling with of I don't know where they are,
Yeah.
right? Or I don't
Hmm.
know if they're not hurting because they
Hmm.
actually had a really painful death, right? Whatever it might be.
Right.
For new moms or new parents,
Mhm.
whatever, some labeling the experience of, oh my gosh, this is so exciting. Well, you must be so excited, Right? Oh, well, you're
Yeah.
so lucky to have 3 months off of work, right? Of whoo.
That's so bad.
Yeah. So anything, again, well-intentioned, right? And
Right,
oftentimes
right,
we can't fault them to a degree because they're
right,
excited and
right.
right. So try and refrain from anything that labels the person's experience for them,
I'm
right? That doesn't mean you can't be excited for them. You
right.
can say, I'm excited for you.
Yeah,
And I also want to know, how are you feeling?
yeah, yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Invite them in for them to tell you what their experience has been like.
Mm-hmm.
I will say for those who are supporting too, if you don't want to know the answer, don't ask. Because that is
Okay.
something people who are grieving, they're like, do you really want to know how I'm doing?
Yeah.
Because then the person who's grieving tells them, and then the person who's supporting becomes really uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And now the griever has to feel like they need to mute their grief to make the other person comfortable.
Right,
So
right.
if you don't want to know how the new mom or new dad or new parent, however you identify, is doing, don't ask.
Don't ask. Okay.
And when you do ask, say truly, how are you doing? I
Yeah.
want to know.
Mm-hmm.
Happy, nitty gritty, so, how are you doing?
Yeah.
Right? Giving them the permission of like, I am here for you.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
How are
Yeah.
you doing?
Yeah.
Um, I always say err on the side of ask, like caution, right? Asking them, what do you need? How can I help? All this stuff.
Yeah.
They may not know, right?
Yeah.
But giving them the space to say first, as opposed to you coming in and saying, well, here's my experience. I blah, 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 right? That feels really overwhelming. Well,
Yeah.
again, very well intentioned.
Mm-hmm.
That may not be what they need,
Yeah.
right? So asking them, what do you need? Or how can I best support you?
Yeah.
They may not know, right? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I understand that. Know that I'm here for you.
Yeah.
And then if they respond that way of I don't know, then you can ask, would it be okay if fill in the blank?
Mm.
Right? I have a blog article that I created the acronym of SEE to let
Mm-hmm.
people know you see them when you
Okay.
are supporting them, right? So it's offering a specific suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
It's eliminating any sort of planning for them, right? So the specific suggestion, just example would be like, I can imagine that meals are really hard for you right now. Would you be
Mm-hmm.
okay if I brought dinner over
Yeah.
on Wednesday at 6:30
Yeah.
and then exploring for them of would that feel okay for you?
Okay. That's
Right? Because
great.
that
Yeah.
eliminates they don't have to figure out what they need,
Right.
when,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So, but that can also be a nice way of you're not telling them you're doing it. You're saying, here's what I'm noticing
Right.
that you might need help with. Here's when I'm free and available to offer it to you. Would that
Yeah.
feel okay? That
Yeah.
still gives them the room to say, thank you, but no, thank you, or yes,
Mm-hmm.
but Wednesday doesn't work. Right. So I can share
Yeah.
that blog with you too. But yeah,
Yes,
that
definitely. I'll put that in the
acronym is
show
nice
notes.
to
Yeah.
help people to let them know I see you.
Yeah.
Right.
That's great. I had just this past year, I had a very close friend lose her husband.
Mm,
And she has a wide network of family and friends, thank God. But it's, you want so much to help. You want so much to ease that person's
mhm.
suffering, but it feels impossible when someone has had a
Yeah.
loss that huge. It feels like there is nothing that I can do that will ease this suffering. But you want to try anyway.
Yeah.
So anything, and I have, reached out to her because sometimes you just don't know what needs to be done, right? I mean, she actually happens to have 3 children ranging in age from like 10 to 16. They have a very busy life.
Mm,
And it's like, can I pick this one up from school for you? Or do you need food? Or, and then you don't want to get annoying because you're like, okay,
right.
I don't want to be constantly up your grill asking you
Yeah.
if you need things, but then when is it? I don't know. It all feels very
And I and,
confusing on
and
how
I
to
think
best
those are
support.
for sure. And so I'll say for those who are supporting, get your own support.
Yeah.
Right? For this reason of like, it feels confusing and it feels helpless. And it's like, and I think it's okay to label and say to them, I know there's nothing I can say that will make this better.
Yeah.
So how can I best support you? How can I best validate and just sit with you in this? Right? Not that
Yeah.
I'm going to take it on for you, but how can I best sit with you in this?
Right.
Um, So yes, if you are supporting someone who's grieving in whatever fashion that looks like, have your own support for sure.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it's okay to check in and ask them of, is this helping?
Yeah.
Right? Does
Mm-hmm.
this feel helpful, or how can this be more helpful?
Yeah.
Or are there areas where I'm just kind of getting in the way?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? I think as long as you keep open communication around that, most
Yeah.
people are willing to, they actually very much appreciate it. The lot of the clients I sit with, they're like, I just wish people would ask.
Yeah.
Right? Because then
Yeah.
that puts them in a weird spot of like, I don't want to be like ungrateful that they're helping, but it's actually causing me more stress.
Right. Right.
Right? So
Yes.
they're actually very grateful that you asked and that you're aware enough to say, hey, this may not be working.
Right.
Right? And, you know, too, for those of you who are supporting, please don't interpret this as it is your responsibility to make sure you understand and can read the mind of the person who's grieving. No, 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 absolutely not.
Mhm.
I do also work with the people who are grieving of like, are there areas that you can communicate to your support system and set boundaries?
Mhm.
Right? So I'm doing work with both sides.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? But I think if, you know, you're transparent and obviously too, depending on the relationship, that
Mhm.
transparency is going to look different.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
So,
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's all wonderful advice. And I feel like we could, I feel like this with so many of my guests, we could talk forever. So many more
yes.
questions. Would you be open to coming back? Because I
Yeah,
feel
I would
like,
love to.
okay, I feel like there's a lot that we didn't explore that would be
Yes.
really valuable to my audience.
Yes.
So,
I
okay,
would
we'll
love
plan
to.
for that. All right.
Yeah,
Well, thank
great.
you so much for being here today.
Thank
And I
you.
will put your information in the show notes. If you want to send me over that blog
Yes.
article, I'll put that in there as well.
Yes. Okay,
Okay.
sounds
All right.
good.
Thank
Great.
you. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
rest of your
You
day.
as well.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.